Matthew 21, verses 33 to 46. The parable of the tenants. Listen to another parable. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard. He put a wall round it, dug a winepress in it, and built a watchtower. Then he rented the vineyard to some farmers and moved to another place. When the harvest time approached, he sent his servants to the tenants to collect his fruit. The tenants seized his servants. They beat one, killed another, and stoned a third. Then he sent other servants to them, more than the first time, and the tenants treated them in the same way. Last of all, he sent his son to them. "They will respect my son," he said. But when the tenants saw the son, they said to each other, "This is the heir. Come, let's kill him and take his inheritance." So they took him and threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. Therefore, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those tenants? "He will bring those wretches to a wretched end," they replied. "And he will rent the vineyard to other tenants, who will give him his share of the crop at harvest time." Jesus said to them, "Have you never read in the Scriptures? The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. The Lord has done this, and it is marvellous in our eyes. Therefore I tell you that the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people who will produce its fruit. Anyone who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces. Anyone on whom it falls will be crushed." When the chief priests and the Pharisees heard Jesus' parables, they knew he was talking about them. They looked for a way to arrest him, but they were afraid of the crowd because the people held that he was a prophet.
If you have any aspirations to own or run a vineyard, you could be forgiven for seeking to draw some of your inspiration from the Gospel of Matthew. Because if you're engaging with this sermon or this service as part of our ongoing series, you'll realise that vineyards feature quite a lot in the stories that Jesus tells within that Gospel. And as I pointed out last week, there is a reason for that, because the vineyard serves as a symbol in religious narratives for the nation of Israel. And many commentators trace this back to the prophet Isaiah, a huge figure in Israel's history and one of the writers of the Old Testament. And he wrote a famous narrative that is often known as the Song of the Vineyard. And we get the impression that Jesus is deliberately casting that story that Katie read for us from the Gospel in the same kind of mould, in the light of what Isaiah said, because it's Isaiah in chapter 5 who coins this phrase. He built a watchtower and dug a winepress, which of course is how Jesus introduces his parable. So it feels that Jesus is deliberately inviting us to contrast this story with the poem that Isaiah wrote several centuries earlier. And that's quite interesting, because there is also a very clear contrast between the two. Isaiah is writing at a particularly difficult time in Israel's history. The halcyon days of the great kings were coming to an end. The land was a shadow of its former self and was under significant military threat from Babylon and Persia. And two distinct narratives begin to emerge from this situation. One was very much in the vein of keep calm and carry on. We're God's people. God will protect us. We don't need to worry. But the more astute prophets like Isaiah were saying something very, very different. And time eventually came to show that it was people like Isaiah who were the true voices of God. And his message was basically, no, we can't expect to somehow escape the impact of this military invasion, which then turned into enforced exile. because we've not been the nation that God has called us to be. We've not yielded the fruits of goodness and righteousness that should hallmark us as God's people. So we have no claim on the providence and the protection of God. And he offers this prophetic foretelling of the demise of the nation using images of crop and harvest. The grapes are bad, says Isaiah. The vineyard has failed to produce the fruit that God, its owner, expected. And so the vineyard will become abandoned and overgrown. Now, most people who heard Jesus tell his vineyard story would have been all too familiar with Isaiah's narrative. And one group of people who would have been particularly familiar with it would have been the religious scholars and office holders, because of course they knew their onions, so to speak. And these are the people who had already found themselves in dispute with Jesus because he was disrupting the life of their temple. But for all that Jesus' story so clearly echoes the one told by Isaiah, and they would have particularly noticed that from the familiar introduction, as I said earlier, Jesus then took the story off in a completely different direction. In Jesus' story, there is no problem with the grape harvest. The issue is not that it's produced rotten fruit. In fact, the reluctance of the tenants to give the vineyard up might cause us to reasonably assume that it was yielding a pretty good harvest. It was yielding a good harvest, but it was yielding a good harvest for them. It was serving their interest, and they'd forgotten whose vineyard it really was. And whereas Isaiah is saying to his hearers, things are pretty bad here, but don't assume that things won't get considerably worse, Jesus is saying in his story, everything might look good and rosy, but there are some serious failings in those who are overseeing things, and the outcome will not be an overgrown vineyard, but a new set of tenants. And once again, we can therefore begin to see how this story connects with and interprets the real life events that are happening around them. The great temple of Herod was acting like a tourist magnet, bringing religious pilgrims from all over the world to come and see it and to celebrate the big religious festivals in it. And the Passover, which Jesus was part and parcel of at this time, had become a real commercial success, which was evidenced by the array of market stalls and money changers that confronted Jesus when he had arrived there a couple of days earlier. But it had lost sight of the God in whose name the people gathered. And Jesus had quite dramatically made that point by driving out the marketeers and the money changers and declaring that it should be a house of prayer. And in this story, Jesus lays the blame for that well and truly at the feet of the vineyard tenants. And as Matthew observes at the end of the narrative in verse 45, the chief priests and the Pharisees knew that he was talking about them. And of course, we can't really read this story ourselves with the benefit of 2,000 years of Christian tradition and not recognize that in a few days' time, Jesus will be put to death by crucifixion. And so we can recognize that Jesus is very much framing his own execution here when he speaks of the Son arriving at the vineyard and then being put to death. And then he draws in another image as he brings this narrative to a conclusion, this time from the Old Testament book of Psalms. And he speaks of a stumbling block that has become a cornerstone, which again is a reference to himself. And so we can see that the big narrative of the death and resurrection of Jesus is beginning to unfold. And as we grasp something of the historical reality of what happened, so we can see again how the gospel is offering a commentary on contemporary circumstances, and it's defining the big narratives of our faith. But other than helping us to recognize that and how we have become the inheritors of God's metaphoric vineyard, what does this confrontation and the parable that emerged from it have to say to us, particularly as we steer our way through some pretty challenging circumstances in our own here and now? Well, I think it says quite a bit. And I want to try and offer that to you on 3 levels. The first is really a reflection on society as a whole. Then I want to think about what it might say to us as a church, and then finally how it might speak to us as individuals. So let's think first about wider society. You know, it's interesting to see that a huge tension for those in government at the moment is how to balance the very real health threat that we're facing, particularly here in the northwest of England, though we are by no means alone in being in areas of high infection, but how government is trying to balance all of that with the demands and the expectations of the economy, or to use the symbolism of Jesus' parable, how to maintain the grape harvest while also keeping everyone healthy. Now, of course, this is a very real and genuine tension. It's on the news virtually every night. After all, there is no point in being safe from infection if we've got no money to feed ourselves or put a roof over our heads. But I have to say that the various debates and discussions that have then come out have reminded me that we live in a world that had pretty much come to exclusively define success in the language of economics. If you're not economically successful, you're not successful. That's the kind of narrative of the world we live in today. And we may have replaced the idea of a grape harvest with words like GDP or economic growth, but the idea remains the same. We measure success by the size of the harvest. And this is what makes Jesus' story so powerful, particularly when held in contrast with the Vineyard song of Isaiah, because he is speaking into a context of apparent success. The temple was being built, the money was rolling in, the festivals were all happening again. But the honour and the place that was due to the one who truly laid claim on that vineyard was being ignored. God had been written out of the equation. And Jesus places his own forthcoming rejection and crucifixion as the latest in this stream of prophets and envoys who had been systematically ignored. It's interesting that lots of people are talking about economic recovery in our current circumstances. But what about our nation's need for a spiritual recovery, which, dare I say, is somewhat overdue? Now, here's the good news. For all the pain and the suffering that COVID has inflicted on us, for the first time, perhaps in a long time, we are being forced to recognise that there is a lot more to well-being than financial growth and income generation. And yes, we have recognised that the cost of our relentless lifestyles can take a virus around the world in a matter of days. We are being forced as nations and as communities of nations to stop and to take stock of what really matters. And responses to that come in many guises. We've been forced to think about the environment and the well-being of our planet. We've been made to ask questions about racial inequality and prejudice. We've been challenged to put the needs of vulnerable people over and above our desires for social gratification. And not everyone has responded equally to those challenges. But many of the things that I'm talking about are key issues that emerge when the New Testament talks about what Jesus describes in Matthew's Gospel as the kingdom of God. And in short, what Jesus is saying here in this parable is that the well-being of a nation will be judged by the place it gives to the one who rightly deserves to be recognized as King of Kings and Lord of Lords, not the economic success of those who may be the rulers, but they are but tenants. And this is not some mindless religious rant on my part, because as I've already observed, the issues that we are being increasingly forced to recognise as of greater importance, that we've perhaps previously not been ready to acknowledge, feature highly in our existing gospel vision of the kingdom of God. Society has been given a wake-up call. And I sense that a real challenge for us as a church as we move forward into whatever the future holds is how do we take hold of these crucial lessons that society is learning and enable people to see their relevance to our understanding of the kingdom of God. There will be those who will be all too keen to press the reset button to get society back to the way it was. And I sense that we as the people of God are going to have some important things to say in the years ahead. And we need to be thinking and reflecting now about how we can articulate our message in the world that emerges. This is a parable addressed to a nation, reminding them not to be blinded by economic and social success and to give God the honour that God deserves. But before we get too critical of others, let's just bring ourselves back to that inescapable dimension of these few chapters in Matthew's Gospel. These events take place in a religious temple. These parables are aimed at the religious classes. And yes, we might recognise that civic office and religious office were much more interlinked in the culture in which Jesus lived, but we cannot ignore that religious dimension, which causes us to ask, what has this parable got to say to us as the church, as God's vineyard today? And again, it's this contrast between Jesus' story and the song of Isaiah that I find so poignant. Because Jesus is making a disturbingly unavoidable point. You can be successful. You can produce a thriving harvest, and you can enjoy the rewards of that harvest, and you can achieve all the signs of outward success and yet still be totally off beam and out of step with God. Religious success is not necessarily a sign of faithful integrity. Now, I think that can offer us both a challenge, but also an encouragement. I know that I've said this before, but our religious activities have been severely curtailed in recent months. And yes, at one level, our response has been to recognise that we can encounter the presence of God in new and no less authentic ways. But as we've begun to now explore our way out of lockdown, it's also caused us to begin to try and re-establish a lot of our religious activities. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But this parable serves as a reminder that successful religious activity is not our primary calling. Our primary calling is to give the glory and the honour to Jesus that he deserves. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't seek to re-establish our church programmes. But as we try and steer our way through all the restrictions and the regulations, success is not measured by how accurately we manage to recreate what we did before, but how and where we honour Jesus in what we seek to do now. And the reason that I want to make that point is not to be difficult or dismissive, but so much of what I am reading at the moment within our Christian community seems to be centred on how we achieve the mechanics and the technicalities of what we do. You know, hand sanitizer and social distancing is important, but what really matters is that Jesus is given the honour and the glory that he deserves. And I think that needs to be the question that we ask ourselves as a church as we steer our way, particularly through the immediate uncertainties. How do we give the glory and the honour to Jesus? The fault of the vineyard tenants was not that they couldn't produce grapes, whatever circumstances came their way, but they'd become so obsessed with producing grapes, so self-seeking in their endeavours, that they'd lost sight of the one in whose name the harvest was being prepared. And I don't want to condemn or criticise anyone who is genuinely seeking to reintroduce the life and activities that once defined us as Christians, but let's hear the message of this parable and not become so consumed by trying to achieve the technicalities that we lose sight of the purpose. But it's that reality that also enables us to apply this story at a very personal level. Because if we are going to use the symbolism of grape harvesting as a way of describing our life and our activities as a community of God's people, then yeah, many of us are really struggling to do that right now. And if I'm not overstretching the metaphor, one thing that we know is if you don't keep on top of your fruit trees, you don't just lose this year's harvest, but without the right pruning and dressing, you begin to put next year's harvest into jeopardy too. So we may well be feeling quite concerned and helpless at the moment because we can't do the things that we deep down feel we should be doing, and we are concerned about what the long-term consequences of that might be. So I hope that we can also hear in this parable a message of reassurance, because as we've highlighted already, the tenants were not judged by the success of their fruit growing, but their attitude to the owner. And this is where I want to take you back to the parable and discussion that is recorded in the earlier part of Matthew chapter 21, where Jesus tells the story of two sons, one who says he's going to go and work and then doesn't, and the one who doesn't and then does. And what Jesus quite explicitly says at the end of that story to those well-to-do, religiously organized people, the rulers and the priests, is that the messed up people that you look down on will enter the kingdom of heaven before you do. And I think that Jesus is making that reference again here when he speaks about a stumbling block that becomes the cornerstone. The people that you're tripping over are going to be the foundation on which God builds his church. The kingdom of God will be taken from the religious organizers and given to others. Now, life is tough and messy right now, and many of us will find it really hard that we can't express our faith in the narratives and the practices that we're used to. But Jesus offers himself to us as our cornerstone. He was only a stumbling block to those who inhabited the vineyard out of their own self-interest. And I know that I'm importing things into this story that aren't really there, but I don't think I'm going against its meaning if I suggest that had those tenants made a complete mess of their grape growing, and had they gone to the owner of the vineyard or the son of the owner completely empty-handed, but just saying, look, we've not managed to grow anything, but nonetheless giving them the respect and honour that they deserve, then I get the feeling that the owner would have had no problem with them. Now, as I say, I'm making my own additions to the story there, but I think the truth that underlies it is absolutely riven through the narrative of our faith. What Jesus seeks from us is not success, but honour, humility, and a willingness to simply recognise him for who he is. So, if I can address you in the language of this parable, if you feel at the moment like a vineyard tenant who's furloughed because you just can't get on with what matters to you, or perhaps you feel that you've got no place in God's vineyard because you haven't got a clue how to grow grapes, or maybe you've even turned your back on that vineyard because for all its success you've seen its tenants at their worst, then this is a story that is laced with grace and opportunity. All God requires of us is to recognize Jesus for who he is. And we can do that in lockdown. We can do that as a frontline key worker. We can do that if we are too afraid to go out of our front door for fear of infection. We can do that if we're well versed in religious activity. And we can do that if we know nothing about religion. All the son who arrived at the vineyard required was to be recognized and accepted for who he was. And all Jesus asks of us is that we accept him for who he is. God is not looking for grapes right now. If they come, they come. Your vineyard might just be your kitchen or your living room. But all that God requires is that you just let him in and recognize that he's there. So may God give us all the grace and the wisdom to do just that.